Okay, well, I'm going to jump right into the message. Usually we have a time of silence and stillness, but today, just because of our schedule and seeing how the transitions go, I'm going to jump right into the message. Wow, I don't know about you guys, but during worship, I was a wreck. I was just being here and being in a sanctuary and not a theater. There's just something about it that it feels different, you know? And so I was just reminded, even as I was writing this message this week, it really personally ministered to me. And so I hope that it speaks to you guys as well, because you just know it's a personal message when you're writing it and you're crying and you're like, God, thank you. And so anyways, I hope it ministers to you guys today. Today, we find ourselves in Mark, and in a few weeks, we're going to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. So by Easter, we're going to finish off our year-plus-long Following the Suffering King series that we've been going through. But today, we find ourselves in Mark 15, verses 33 to 39, and this is the death of Jesus. And I will read the passage right now. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of those standing near heard this, they said, listen, he's calling Elijah. Someone ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to him to take him down. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. Amen. So today we find ourselves in this passage where Jesus is hanging on the cross in pain, in humiliation, in agony. Darkness has covered the land. And I'm sure that if the disciples were there, there is no mention of the disciples. But if the disciples were there at this point, they're probably thinking, okay, Jesus, now it's really time. I know you let them humiliate you. I know you let them arrest you. I know you let them hit you and beat you. But Jesus, now is the time where you really need to show them who you really are. You need to flip over some tables again. You need to take this matter into your hands. But eventually, as we read in this passage, Jesus breathes his last breath and he dies. And if defeat didn't overcome his followers before, it certainly has overcome them now. They're just seeing their Savior dead, hanging on the cross. As I was writing this message, I was debating whether or not to share this because it could kind of shift the mood of the passage. But I just couldn't help but to think of Endgame. If you guys know me, you know that I love that movie and I love Marvel. But as I was writing it, I kept thinking about Endgame because a few weeks ago, William and I, we were surfing after the kids went down and we couldn't find anything to watch. So he was like, honey, let's watch Endgame, the last 40 minutes, right? So we turn it on and we're just like two, 35-year-olds like watching Endgame quietly while the kids are sleeping. But as I was watching it, I was like, oh my gosh, I forgot how epic and glorious this fight scene is, right? So we're both like, dude, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is such a good movie. We forgot how good it is. But as I was writing this message, I wanted to bring up Endgame because that last battle scene, if you guys haven't seen Endgame, it's the most epic battle scene between good and evil in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It is the time when the Avengers are being beaten down, like Captain America's shield is broken, and everyone looks like there's just no hope, right? And they're looking at Thanos and they're like, okay, we'll just give it what we got. And everything feels hopeless. The music is like, it just sounds like everyone's gonna die. And then suddenly, you guys know what happens, the time spirals appear. I remember when the time spirals appeared in the theater, I was literally like tears coming down my face because I was going through such a hard time at that season. I was like, oh my gosh, like God is always with us like that. Like he shows up, you know? And I remember I looked at William and I was like, oh my gosh. And Okay, I'm going to just share this part too. You know when Captain America, the hammer part, where the hammer goes into Captain America's hand? Thor's hammer goes into Captain America's hand. I looked at William and I was like, is he a god? Oh my gosh, what's going on right now? And William was like, honey, stop. Shh, right? And then I looked at my neighbor and I was like, is he a god? Is he a god? It was just such a glorious fight scene. It was so victorious. But what made it so victorious? What made it so glorious? It's because there was still a plan in motion when nobody else could ever fathom that victory was at hand. And in the same way, I'm going to bring it back to Jesus here. As Jesus is hanging on that cross, the disciples are in darkness. His followers are in darkness. It says darkness has covered the entire land. And how many of us, similar to the Avengers or the disciples, have experienced darkness? How many of us have experienced a season of darkness, of doubt and disappointment, where it feels like there is no hope, there is no light, there is no way out? For some of us, we might even find ourselves in a season of darkness where it feels pitch black, as we find ourselves in immense pain and you can't even see a way forward. And yet we see that as Jesus is hanging on the cross, in this particular passage, that in the midst of darkness, God was still moving. He was still acting. He still had a plan in motion. And so what does this tell us? It tells us that even in our darkness, God is still at work. And so today, the title of my message is Even in Darkness. And I want to address the question, what is God doing in our darkness? I'm going to continue in this passage. The passage begins by describing darkness covering the land as Jesus hung on the cross. Scholars point out that at noon, when sunlight should have been the brightest, an unnatural darkness set in, which was typically interpreted at that time as divine judgment. The darkness was divine, it was intentional. There was something that was happening in the natural world as physical darkness covered the earth. But there was also a supernatural purpose behind it. And the darkness that covered the land represented the spiritual condition of humanity, our sins, our depravity, our brokenness, the darkness that Jesus was entering in to take upon the cross. And so it was for our sin, our depravity, our darkness that Jesus is hanging on the cross. And as Jesus is hanging on the cross, this is God reaching down into humanity to save his people. This is God, by sending his son Jesus, entering into the darkness of the world to unravel his plan. At that time, the Jews, and I'm sure many Israelites, they thought God had forgotten about them. They thought God had forsaken them, but God was still moving as he was sending Jesus to die on this cross. And as Jesus was dying on the cross and hanging on the cross, when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? This cry was an expression of the pain that Jesus felt as he experienced separation from the Father. This was the agony as he felt as the wrath of God was being poured upon him. And as he was on the cross, he was being forsaken so that we would never have to be forsaken. And so just as God entered into the darkness of this world by sending his son Jesus, God enters our darkness today. And that's my first point. He enters into our darkness. I know that some of us, if not many of us, are in a place of darkness right now. You might find yourselves in spiritual darkness where your relationship with God might be under question. You might feel distant from God. You might feel far from God. I know that for our church, there are a lot of people that are here wrestling with, is God really there? Does God really care for me? When our relationship with God seems distant or silent, sometimes the things that we think are, is God withholding or withdrawing from me? Is he trying to teach me a lesson? Some of us might be in emotional darkness where there's seasons and moments where we experience grief. We experience depression because of our circumstances. We experience confusion or being lost. We all experience darkness, and it's natural for us to search for answers and to wonder, God, where are you? God, have you left me? God, have you forsaken me? And that's the place that Jesus was in as he was in that cross. He was saying, God, I'm in so much pain right now. And so as I was studying this passage, I found a quote by Tim Keller that speaks about the cross and suffering. It says, when we suffer, we ask God, why? And Christianity is the only faith where God himself actually cried out in suffering, why? When you look at the cross, it won't give you the reason for your suffering, but it will tell you the reason it isn't. It can't be that he doesn't love you. It can't be that he has abandoned you. It can't be that he doesn't have plans for you. He abandoned Jesus so he would never have to abandon you. And so Tim Keller says when we look, it goes on to say, when we look at the cross and we see Jesus hanging on the cross, we can't talk to Jesus the same way when we know that he went through what we went through. When we know that Jesus was hanging there and in pain and suffering, and he was abandoned so that we never have to be abandoned. Jesus experienced the full range of emotions, the betrayal, the disappointment, the pain, the agony, so that he would be able to relate to us. And so God enters into our darkness through Jesus, and he enters into our darkness today. God is not passively watching us. He's not sitting back and thinking that he needs to teach us a lesson, but he's crying with us. He's embracing us. He's walking with us. He understands us. And so if you're in darkness today, I want to encourage you to look to the cross and remember, we might not know why we're suffering, but we just know that he's with us. He's not going to abandon us. And not only does God enter our darkness, he reveals himself in our darkness. In this passage, the disciples, the ones closest to Jesus, are nowhere to be seen. And the bystanders are there. And scholars who, as I was studying this passage, scholars say that the bystanders are likely Jews, people who are familiar with Jesus, people who knew about Jesus because they're talking about Elijah and they're taunting him and mocking him. And so the disciples are not there. The Jews that are bystanding are watching him and mocking him. And on the contrary, we see a centurion. This passage talks about a centurion, someone who is unfamiliar with Jesus, someone who hasn't shared a meal with Jesus as the disciples did, someone who was part of the Roman government. And it was this centurion that has a revelation of who Jesus actually is. See, up until this point, everyone followed Jesus for what he did, but not who he was. They followed Jesus for his works, but not his worth. They followed Jesus for his miracles, but not his identity as the Messiah. But it was this centurion who had not seen Jesus perform any miracles, that has not sat face to face with Jesus, that has the revelation of who he truly is. In verse 39, it says that when the centurion saw how Jesus died, he confessed and said, "Surely this was the Son of God." As a centurion, he's seen countless deaths on the cross before. But there was something about the way that Jesus died. There was something different about Jesus. That when he saw Jesus, he said he must have truly been the Son of God. And as I was sitting and meditating on this passage, I'm convinced that while the disciples experienced the power of his miracles, the power of Jesus, this centurion was pierced by the beauty of Jesus. It says that in verse 39, when the centurion saw how Jesus died, when the centurion saw that he cried out and the way he died, I believe that he was seeing Jesus' humility, Jesus' weakness, Jesus' love. And as he saw him, he saw Jesus for who he truly is. A commentary I read said that the cross is the intersection where God meets humanity. The cross is where God reveals himself to man. And in this moment, When darkness covered the land, God's greater plan was being revealed. He was revealing himself to us. And in the same way, in our darkness, this is my second point, it's in our darkness God reveals himself to us. Just as God was revealing himself to the centurion in the midst of this darkness, in the midst of hopelessness, God reveals himself to us. Just like the centurion, we are being invited to experience God for who he truly is and not what he can offer us. If you find yourself in a place of darkness today, it is truly an invitation from God to spiritual maturity, to grow deeper with him, to know him more, to grow in your walk with God. Our time in darkness is a time of spiritual maturity if and only if we are willing to be clay in the potter's hands. I read a quote by Charles Spurgeon that said, "God is too good to be unkind. He is too wise to make a mistake. And when I can't trace his hand, I can always trust his heart." It's often in darkness and when we can't make sense of situations, we can't make sense of the answers that we're looking for, that we keep looking, God, what are you doing? What are you doing? Where are your hands? But it's in our darkness that God invites us to trust his heart, that he cares for us. If you guys have been at our church for the past year, whenever I'm up here, I vulnerably share that this past year was a very difficult year for me. It was a year of intense healing. It was a year of intense healing where oftentimes I would look for the light at the end of the tunnel. If you've ever been in a season of intense healing, people often say that it's like an onion. Right when you've grieved something, you've grieved a loss, you've processed, or you feel like you're getting better, another layer forms, and you're like, oh, well, I didn't know I had to deal with that too. I didn't know I had to face that too. And I remember last year as God was leading me deeper and deeper into a valley, as I had to let go of relationships that I didn't want to let go of, as I had to grieve losses that I never grieved. I remember God was saying, just trust me. And at some point last year, I just grew really tired. And I remember I was talking to my friend Liz. I don't know if she's in here, but shout out to Liz. And I was like, Liz, I'm just so tired. I'm just wondering when I'm going to get better and when I'm going to feel better. And I remember Liz in her sweetest voice, and we all know that she has that mother authority if you know her. I remember she said to me, Andrea, I want to encourage you to stop looking for the light at the end of the tunnel. Trust the journey. Trust that God's with you. Trust that he's going to stay with you through it. I remember when she texted that to me, I sat down and I just broke down crying and I told God, I'm tired. I'm grieving the same things. This valley just seems to be getting darker and darker. Why is it the same things over and over and over again? The pain won't go away. And I remember as I was praying that, I saw an image of myself as a child, a little girl, walking into a valley, deeper and deeper into a valley with a candle. And I saw the candle. The candle was dimly lit, but it was not flickering, it was steady. And as I walked deeper and deeper into the valley, the light got brighter and brighter. And as I was sitting down and praying, I realized the more that I saw that image, the light wasn't getting brighter, the darkness was just getting darker. And I felt God was saying, even when it gets dark, and the darker it gets, the more bright my light gets. My light never changes, it just gets brighter as it grows darker. And I felt God just saying, Andrea, I'm never going to leave you. I'm always going to be with you. And I don't know who needs to hear that today, but I just remember I couldn't hold it together when I saw that. I was reminded of John 1 when it says, the light shines in the darkness and the darkness has not overcome it. It's in our darkness that God's light shines brightly. It's his love is ablaze. His wisdom is brilliant. His light does not flicker. It does not change. His light will always pierce through no matter how dark it is. And the darker it gets, the brighter his light shines. And so it is in darkness God reveals himself to us. It's in darkness, it's in times of suffering you experience the comfort of God. It's in times of doubt you experience the steadfastness of his love. It's in times of weariness you experience the strength of God. It's in times of failure and shame you experience the grace of God. And it is in times of loneliness you experience the nearness of God. When we are in darkness, God reveals himself to us, and that is greater than anything that he could ever do for us, because now you know him. You get to see him for who he truly is. You get to have a true and right revelation of how glorious he is, how steadfast he is, how amazing he is, how marvelous his love is. And so God reveals himself in our darkness. And finally, my last point is that not only does God reveal himself in our darkness, he is doing his greatest work. As Jesus hung on the cross, it seemed that darkness was winning. For the Avengers, it seemed that Thanos was going to have the final say. But we all probably knew, like, they wouldn't do that to us, right? But in this moment, it seemed that death had the final win. But in verse 38, it says that when Jesus died, the veil was torn in two from top to bottom. And this was the moment that changed history forever. So there's an irony, right? That as Jesus is hanging on the cross, the greatest disappointment, the greatest defeat turns into our greatest victory. And it's something that the disciples, the people that were following Jesus, would have never fathomed would happen. But as the veil was being torn, God was permanently removing the barrier between us and God. His blood was being poured out so that we would have full access to him. This was the day that the Israelites didn't know, the Jews didn't know, but this is the day they were waiting for. This is the moment that Jesus was speaking about. This is the moment the prophets were saying were coming. So in this moment of darkness where doubt and disappointment seemed like it was going to win, God was doing something. And in the same way, it is in times of our greatest darkness, he is doing his greatest work. It is in times of darkness, and especially in prolonged seasons of darkness, discouragement, and in weariness, that he's doing his greatest work. I want to encourage you today, if you find yourself in darkness where you can't make sense of things, you're wondering where he is, I want to encourage you, he is working. It's often when we're in darkness, we wrestle, we waver, we doubt. And I want to be honest with you guys, because I've been there and I am there. There are days where I find myself, God, I don't know what you're doing. But it's in those moments that we can be honest with God. And we can trust him. Because the truth is that we can't rationalize or understand the ways of God. Even if we tried to make sense of what he was doing, our feeble human minds could never understand it. He is the Alpha and Omega. He is the beginning and end. He knows our lives even before we were conceived in our mother's wombs. He knows what he's doing. And so in Ephesians 3:20, it says, God is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we can even ask or think. You can't even ask for the things that God is doing because it's that great. You can't even imagine or fathom because he is doing abundantly more than that. He could take your greatest pain and make it into your greatest testimony. And see, just as Joseph's years in prison led to the saving of an entire nation, just as Hannah's tears and barrenness led to the prophet Samuel being born, just as Jesus' death on the cross led to our eternal freedom, in your darkness, in our darkness, God is doing exceedingly abundantly more than what we could ever ask or imagine. And it's in our darkness that the healing you thought was not possible is happening. It's in the darkness that the intimacy is being formed with him in the midst of your tears. There's preparation taking place for your purpose. You might not know it. It might feel like you're breaking down, but he's actually preparing you for the very things that he's called you to do. And so there are doors that are opening that you've never knocked on. All we see are the closed doors, but we don't see the open doors that God is opening when we're not even watching. There's so much that God does when we can't see it. And so even in our darkness, God is always doing something. And I want to argue God is doing his greatest work. When it feels like he's dismantling, he's unearthing, it might feel like he's breaking you down or he's trying to destroy you, he's actually doing his greatest work. I want to invite the worship team as I come to a close. I have 2 application points for you guys today. And the first is this. I want to encourage you today to welcome God into your darkness. I don't know about you guys. I'm not a fighter. I'm an avoider. In our marriage, William is the fighter. He's like, honey, like, it bothers me when you do this. And, or we'll fight. And then I'll kind of like shrink away and like, oh my gosh, I want to escape this right now. And I kind of avoid and I tend to ignore and I tend to avoid difficult emotions, which my therapist tells me I need to work on. And so for me, I've realized in times of darkness, I also avoid God. I don't tell him the difficult things. I don't tell him how I'm actually feeling. I don't tell him how deeply disappointed I am. He's God. How could I say that to him? A lot of times we spiritual bypass our pain. Spiritual bypassing is when we use our religious verses and scriptures and ideas to numb and avoid our pain. There have been times in my life I was in excruciating pain and I'm like, God, I know you got this, but I don't think he got it. I want to encourage you today, welcome him into your darkness. If you can't see him now, look at the cross. And just remember that death that he died for you, it wasn't because he didn't want to be with you, it was so that he can be with you. It wasn't because he doesn't love you, it's because he does love you. And so welcome him into your darkness. And how do we do that? We pray honest prayers. We have honest conversations with God. And might I say, we even sit in silence. You just sit in his presence. You let his presence do the work. My second application point is invite others into your darkness. There's some of us in this room, we've been sitting in darkness way longer than God has intended us to. There's some of us, we've been sitting in darkness all by ourselves, and you were not designed to do life alone. You were not designed to walk through this darkness alone. I want to encourage you, you need friends or people in your life who are going to weep with you. You need people in your life who are going to cry with you. You need people in your life who are going to fight with you. There have been times in my life where I struggled stepping into this calling of ministry, and some of my closest friends, they were like, oh, I'm just so frustrated. And I'm like, are you getting sick of me sharing my struggles? And they're like, no, I'm just so angry at the devil. He just keeps lying to you. He keeps bothering you. He keeps deceiving you. And you need friends who are going to fight this battle with you. You need friends who are going to remind you that this is spiritual warfare. You need friends who are going to pull you out of darkness. So invite others into your darkness. Don't sit there alone. Don't navigate it alone, but invite others into your darkness. And right now, I'm just going to close with this story about my brother who's actually sitting here today. A couple years ago, actually not a couple years ago, maybe like 7 years ago now, my brother was going through a difficult season, and I got permission to share this with you guys. But as his older sister, my heart was always very heavy whenever I saw my brother, because whenever I saw him, I could tell that he was very depressed. There was a lot of darkness. He looked lifeless. And as an older sister, I didn't really know what else to do, but just to say, hey, are you okay? Or just to laugh with him, eat with him. Didn't know what to do. But I remember there was a specific few months where he was being hospitalized every month. And he would go to the hospital because he would be vomiting and he couldn't stop. And then the doctors would tell him, there's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with your body. The reports, your blood tests, everything's fine. There's nothing wrong with you. And then I remember he was on a trip in Italy with his friend. And my mom called me. And she said, your brother's in the hospital again. And she said, I think something's wrong. I think I need to go over to Italy and bring him back. And I was like, right when she said that, something in me just knew it was God. Like, I know that in my flesh, who I really am, I'm usually a very scared person. I'm like, okay, I don't know. But right when my mom said something's happening in Italy, I was like, this is God. I just knew God was doing something. And I remember right when I got that call, I went in my room and I sat down and I said, God, intervene. I know you're doing something. I know this is you. It just felt like something. I just knew he was doing something. And it's maybe an instinct that only a sister could have, or, you know, as a mom now, I know there's just mother instincts I have. And I remember my mom went and brought him back. And when she brought him to our house, he looked like a zombie. His eyes were just like dark up to his cheek. And I remember he was just staring out the window and he didn't have words. And I asked him what happened. And he said, in Italy, the doctor looked at him and said, son, there's nothing wrong with your stomach. The problem is here and here. And the doctor was telling him, you're depressed. And when the doctor told my brother that, he broke down crying because something in him broke. Like, oh, I'm depressed. I didn't know. And all that to share years later, I remember in that time, I told him, I feel like God's doing something. And it was crazy. He came back. He quit his job. He quit his job. And then he went to Bethel where he started doing worship. And years later, he's here. And he's been on this healing journey. And I look back and I just think how in that moment where it felt like everything was falling apart, my mom was convinced like something bad was going to happen, something worse. God was actually doing his greatest work. And I just want to encourage you guys, God is doing his greatest work in our darkness. Wherever you are today, he's with you. He's not going to abandon you, and he's always doing something. Let's just close our eyes, and we'll have the worship team close in a song.